So before the break, we talked about using Confluence to manage your Atlassian governance structure with the ASC and the APAG and the ASAG and the user groups. Now we're going to talk about how to roll that into Jira. So I'm going to come over here to my fancy app switcher and go to Jira. All right, so the first thing I've done is created a dashboard, but really you should look at that at the end. So I'm going to go to workflows, and I'm going to talk about useful workflows. That is me. That you can use in Jira. So the idea is that you really want to, gosh, I gotta find these. All right, so we're gonna go to view. All right, so let's talk about nominating people for a committee. That's an important activity. And the first thing we need to do is maybe have a workflow for it so we can track people through the nomination process. So we would create a ticket for the nominee, maybe write up some information about them. We'd go through we would say, hey, we're nominating them, go through the voting process. If they fail, they go back again, they get appointed, they maybe go through a quick onboarding, and then they're closed out, and now they are on the committee. Of course, you can do this in whatever situation you want to do for your own company, doesn't matter, but running it through a workflow would make it really easy to track it and see how you're doing on that. Coming back here, let's talk about buying an add-on. Well, after you decided we're going to buy it, you maybe go through a validation step, you maybe go through bidding because purchasing gets involved in all of this, then you go through the purchase order, then you close it out. Maybe there is the step in here where you are implementing the add-on. It's up to you, but this is one way to track when you're adding on new things to your Jira instance. Because why not? It provides visibility and people understand where you're going. Go back. So then we have a policy change. This is one of the more fun ones. So you have a policy for your Atlassian applications, Jira, HipChat, Confluence, etc., and you want to make a change. So first of all, after you've gotten it approved, maybe, oh no, I'm sorry, that's a different workflow. So we start out with our policy proposal. It gets drafted, it goes to review. Maybe there's a second review process that we use. Maybe it goes back to drafting because it fails the review first. Then it gets approved, then it gets implemented. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head what all the workflows are that I named for these because it was a little while ago that we did this. Just ignore those. Steve, do you want to explain variance for a moment? Because as I recall, this is where we track mistakes.
We don't have two microphones.
Oh, we only have one microphone. All right, well, I'm going to do my best to explain.
It's an event during a policy.
Okay, so while you have a policy going on, if there's a problem, if that policy is broken for some reason, maybe you want to track instances of that. Maybe that's your company culture, maybe it's not, but if you have a variance in a policy, I call it an oops, you could track it this way. So the problem happens, you investigate it, it gets reviewed. We then go modify the policy to make sure it doesn't happen again, or we do a corrective action or something in there. I wouldn't use this to beat over people's heads. I would use it to just help track changes that are happening to say that, oh yeah, this is obviously something that we didn't look at. That's okay. Let's not do that mistake again, or let's modify things so that our intention in that is good. So you can track policy variances that way. Where's the, user product request. That's the best one right there. This is where we democratize add-ons. So, hey, Joe user, you want a new add-on? That's fantastic. Come open one of these issues, and then it's on you to research it, find out if it's good or not, for instance. Then you need to gather interest. Then you're going to present it to the Atlassian Products Steering Committee. If it's going to be on the roadmap, that's fine, but maybe not for next year. It goes to on hold with a comment. Obviously, this is not a totally built-out workflow because you never have a status that goes like that, but that's fine. And then after that, after it gets approved, it goes to purchasing, which kicks off the other workflow that we already saw, where we go through the validation, the bidding, the installation, etc. Oh, I'm sorry, installation's here. After purchasing, it comes back here, and you can use automation to make that work, right? Of course, you can have this step automatically create a purchasing issue type, and then it runs through its workflow, and then when it gets closed, it kicks back to configuration, and so now the admins are configuring it. They add some documentation into Confluence. Now it's closed out. So this is really the heart of the.
Can I say one?
Oh, please do. Just get close to me so you can hear me.
It's not. We only have one. Okay, I will have that.
We're just going to stand next to each other.
So, no. The thing I really like about this workflow is it incorporates multiple aspects of what we talked about this morning, right? So here we are actually gathering interest. This is the user who wants the add-on that's out there talking to other users, right? So we don't have a top-down approach. We have a lateral approach to activity that's going on across users. Here we have it on hold. So if 6 months from now, some other user says, gee, I wonder if we're going to buy something like Jira Suite Utilities, he can go in and do some research to see if anybody ever submitted a request in the past to buy Jira Suite Utilities. He's going to find this thing that's been sitting out there for on hold for 6 months. He can go back to this guy and talk to him and say, hey, what happened with Jira Suite Utilities? Why did it go on hold? Then as we come around here, we're actually using a nested workflow, which is really cool. And then it comes into configuration. Now we're engaging the ASAG. We can actually set up the ASAG before this because we know it's going to come out of purchasing so that we can schedule them. And now we're actually incorporating our activities into our governing bodies. And then documentation, of course. So the users are now the ones that are driving the documentation and the best practices and all of the elements that you want. So it's not your governing bodies that are actually having to do this. It's actually this whole grassroots type process. So that's one of the reasons why I really like this workflow, because it actually implements some of those really key features around that.
Thanks, Steve. Any questions about that workflow? Because this is the one that we all really enjoy, because it makes everyone's life up top a whole lot easier. All right. So what am I missing here? I think I'm still missing policy or annual policy. We did purchase policy change, nominations. I think that's it. So now, once you have all those workflows and all those issue types in place, then you can build yourself a governance dashboard, which I have here. So let's make sure I talked about variance, user product request, purchase, policy change, nomination. Yes. So here you could track all of your in-process things. I think the filter here again is filter by unresolved. And you can see where they are in their life cycle here. You could also, I think, run a status category here instead. So you could just do to do in progress done, perhaps. Or you could do a filter list instead, if you prefer that kind of view. And then over here, depending on if you find any sort of statistics interesting or not, you could see that 60% of things are in open and 40% are closed, or you basically track it by issue type within your governance project. And of course, all of these are what you saw fed back into the Confluence page earlier. So we'll just slow down there for a minute and enjoy this. So now, at one glance, you see all of your governance in process right here. And anybody that has any questions about it can come here, take a look at the dashboard, click into the issue, find out what's going on. So if we go to nomination, we can go find out, oh, look, I'm being nominated for the ASAG. How neat. Yeah. Or if we have a purchase, we can find out about that. So somebody wants to add structure for Jira. It's in to do. We all know where that lives now. So any questions about that? I think this is particularly cool. Oh, yeah. So we also have one that we build sometimes called annual policy. And let me see if I made that issue type. It's not on the dashboard, but that's because it's not really something that you track. So it's an issue type that encompasses the policies for an entire year. And if you're going to have a policy change for next year, you could stack it up on next year's annual policy. And you could link all of these issues in a hierarchy to that annual policy. And that workflow is just, open, closed, or maybe backlog, open, closed. So that anybody anytime can click into annual policy and then see all of the current policies enacted there. And then you could dump those onto a Confluence page as well to see all of the actual voted on, committee-approved policies, as opposed to the best practices and standards that we talked about earlier. These are actually things that got decided by committee. And then you can also wrap them all up in an annual version too, if you want. So we all know that in Jira, you use versions to sort of timestamp collections of issues across a period of time. You could use a version as well for that. So sort of out-of-the-box ways to use Jira to track other processes. Obviously, we use these a lot for like HR processes as well. We use them to onboard instructors. So why not use it for your company policies? Cool. So that's how you use Jira to do everything about governance that we're talking about today. Do you guys have any other ideas that you use for yourselves that you'd like to add to this, or any other ways that you track your own? We now have a microphone.
What level of product change do you? You've got user product requests. Is user product request also changes to configuration? Like, at what level is it? We're just going to make a change to the system that's subtle, to a change to the system that's large.
Right. Yeah. That's huge. So the product request is definitely at something that costs money. And the other useful thing that I forgot to mention that is you can also link these to all the other ones that were done before it, so that people see a history of how many times somebody's asked for structure and had it rejected. But as far as little tweaks, I think that I think you would want to write that sort of level into your standards in Confluence for the administrators. If somebody on an isolated workflow needs change, that's really not a problem, unless of course you have the whole dev test prod system that you do, where you have to go make the changes in dev and then in test and then roll them into prod, which is fine too, because that's a good way to protect your system. But I think it really depends on things that affect many people versus things that affect one small team. And I think the admins have to know and understand that.
Your question actually also brings up a broader governance question of what level do we want to track things from a governance standpoint, right? So some of these things may be very small. Maybe we don't want to worry about it because we don't want to make things onerous for people. I get this question all the time, not about governance, but almost any type of project. Should we do this? Should we do that? And the question I always ask back is, well, what are you trying to see at the end of the day? Because everything we do in Jira is really for visualization later on. So if you're trying to see something out of it, then yeah, it might be good to create a ticket, maybe even a small ticket like a subtask. If you don't need to see it, then maybe just keep it off of this platform.
But yeah, I think company norms would dictate that as well. So you could run. I mean, I wouldn't want to run little tweaks through this either. That would be very arduous, I would think. But for the things that affect a lot of people, and especially just things that relate to money, I think that's worth tracking and making visible. Whereas the small tweaks, if it affects more than one team, I think the blog post feature would work well for that. If it's large sweeping changes, then I would use a banner perhaps. I've also worked with companies that use the banner as like a did you know to sort of stop inquiries from coming in all the time. Like, did you know issues actually live in projects, not on boards? Stuff like that. But yeah, company by company for sure. How do you guys split it up? Or do you? Or do you track any of it?
We track our changes. Yeah, we track our changes, but I guess it's using the same sort of approach. What are things that don't cost anything, but how many people do they affect? Mm-hmm. So, but it's not documented. It's just using common sense. Yeah. So I guess don't hire idiot admins. That's really the first step. And actually, something we do in our company that I really admire is that we set company policy aimed at the best employees, not the worst. So we have vacation policies that work for our really high performers. And for the people that aren't performing, well, that gets addressed. But this enables everybody the freedom to be their best as opposed to constrained to the lowest common performer. All right, so that's all the Jira stuff. And for the next 30 minutes or so, I was going to talk about a series of best practices that we use. We talk about a lot of these in our Jira bootcamp, but these are more aimed at governance. So I'll start with that. So first of all, the number one is reduce the number of administrators. I'm sure that we all have horror stories of either walking into a borrowed instance or something else with 30, 40, 50 administrators, or where everybody is an administrator, in which case nobody really is. So the very first thing that we do is highly recommend that everybody reduce administrators. And we have kind of a rough ratio. What is it, like 1 or 2 for every 1,000 users? But it's not a straight line. And you just throw on more FTEs as the overhead becomes greater. But by doing that, you really avoid, like in some companies that I work with,
I'm always amazed suddenly when a new add-on pops up and somebody asks me about it. Like, I have no idea what that add-on is, even though I'm one of the main prod administrators. Your guess is as good as mine. Let me go in the logs and find out who installed it and go ask them. So yeah, reducing the number is extremely helpful. The other thing to do that we already talked about is maintain admin documentation. These are the changes that I made internally. Even administrators could just post in that part of the Confluence space and sort of keep track of why and how they're making the changes. So command intent, which is a great military example of, if people know the why, they can make good decisions absent leadership. So if you know why we're making this change or why we make changes like this, the next time I don't have to go ask you, I just know the general intent here and I can go make an appropriate change in line with that general intent. We also like to keep a folder of most commonly used links. This is just me as an admin, but for me, I keep a Jira folder right here that has all of the most commonly used settings pages and things that I'm always having to tweak. This is more of a developer. Like, I just hate clicking mice so many times things. So I use that for most of what I do. Project standards. So we recommend always using shared configuration when making a new project so you don't get all of those config elements dumped into your Jira backend. Of course, when there is the first time you make a project, you'll have to make it based on a standard template. That's okay. And maybe the first time that you make a brand new project, and if you don't have configurations made for it yet, you could do the create from template. But we do strongly recommend that you go and clean up all the garbage afterwards. Maybe you set a policy that every couple months an admin goes through and cleans things up. But then you also get into the question of outcome versus output. Is it really worth going and cleaning it up if it's not really slowing you down? And as I said before, I love a clean house more than anything. But at the same time, it might just be wasting my time to go and hunt down every unused screen. Or maybe when the company has a down cycle, then I go do that. But for the most part, it's keeping prod alive and helping end users. Using an archive category and a permission scheme for online archiving. This is a pretty standard practice, but like small companies, when they're first starting out, they might not know about that. Maybe you would have two archiving permission schemes. One is read-only and one is hidden. That would be very helpful for the users that are transferring from old projects to new projects but still want to keep their data. For example, if you're scaling Jira and you have a new series of templates that you're using, keeping their old data read-only is very helpful for them. On export, this is a fun one that if you've ever done a full project export and you didn't look into this, you might have made a mistake. Making sure that you're in the right permission scheme and all of the security schemes associated with that, or all the security levels associated with that project so that you don't miss out on anything in a CSV export. That's something that if you don't set up your system so that admins can always see everything all the time, which I think most people don't set it up that way because there's always project X that nobody's supposed to look at. But remembering to go in and make sure that you reset yourself for the permissions when you're doing a backup is very important. Using a test project in prod, yeah, this is all standard stuff that has its own config elements, its own screens, its own workflows, its own issue types, etc. Unless you have a test prod model where you only make changes in test and then push them. I always keep a prod test project. It's called Bryan's test project. It's high in the alphabet. I can find it very easily. All the elements are named after me as well, so I can find them and tweak them very quickly to do user test cases, for example. All right, talking about roles now. So project roles, I think that if you have a small company and if you are able to have all of those good conversations with your fellow coworkers, you can really push out administrative responsibilities to the project administrators. So one thing that we do with very small companies is we have notification-based roles. So notify on everything, notify only on create, notify on updates, notify on comment, and then the project administrator can actually go in and add people to that role so that we're not tweaking notification schemes, because you might have individuals that want to see everything. We have some of those in our company. And you might have people that only want to know the big stuff. So you can do that out by role. You can also do permissioning out by role as well. So you would have a role that is view all issues, a role that is view only assigned issues. You could have a role that is can edit and transition but can't close issues, for example. It just kind of depends on the way you break up work in your company. Now, I would not suggest that at all for a large company, because for a large company, you'd have to go train every new project admin on how to do that. It would be way more work than it saves. So for that, standardization and the snarky line that I don't tell people, but is if you want a custom workflow or custom notifications, go work for a small custom company. You are working for a giant corporation. We have standards, unfortunately. I don't say that. I say, this is the way it is, and let me help you with it. Resolutions, statuses, priorities, and links. Oh my gosh, please pare them down if you can. All of those. Again, resolutions. I can't tell you the number of redundant resolutions that I roll into, and it becomes so incredibly confusing for the end user. And it makes it hard later on to do reporting on your issues too, because was it complete, done, or resolved, no issues? Yeah. So having a policy documented ahead of time for your administrators, or making sure that your administrators have been trained to not add a resolution for every individual user's needs is huge. Same goes for statuses, same goes for priorities. Now that we have priority schemes, this has been a lot easier, but still, you don't want to have everything cluttering up the database. Also, issue link types. Jira is pretty good out of the box. I don't know many more that have to be added. Some add-ons have to have additional ones, but if you can, keeping those as standard as possible so that they don't duplicate any other link type, it's just going to make your end user's life a whole lot easier later on. I'm sure we all have bad stories about that too. Issue types. Try not to keep your business logic here. So I've seen a lot of places where they have project and team specific issue types even, and this is of course before people know about custom fields or before they know about you can put more than one issue type in a project. It's amazing the lack of knowledge that leads to creating so many issue types that are redundant. So keeping one issue type called support works for many different team types. And if you really need to break out more than one support ticket within a project, okay, then you might want to consider going to another one. But basically naming things generically across the board is really helpful because people can usually infer, and a little bit of training and normalization goes a long way for not having to make all these extra config elements in the database. Only add a new issue type to a project when you need a new workflow or a new set of screens or a new set of required fields. This is very standard Jira knowledge, but something to remember. You don't need an extra issue type to differentiate between the same kind of work that you're doing. You really only need it if you need a new workflow. Otherwise, a managed custom field with a dropdown would handle that differentiation very clearly for you. If you need a hierarchy, of course, portfolio and structure are both two great add-ons that will give you a hierarchy beyond just the standard Jira epic story. Any questions so far? This might be all common knowledge so far, but I think for some people watching, some of this might be new and hopefully very helpful. No? All right. Moving on. Workflows, ops bar sequence. Do we all know about the ops bar sequence property in a workflow? You can basically control where the transition appears, in what order. I use not necessarily a Fibonacci sequence, but I always go by 10, 20, all the way up to 100. So let me, I'll just try to explain this visually. So starting at the beginning of the workflow, every transition, I start with 10, and then 20, and 30, and 40, and 50, all the way up to 100. Hopefully there's not more than 10 transitions, unless you have a very custom workflow. Then for all the ones going backwards, I start at 110, so 110, 120, or sorry, 110, 120, 130. And what this does is it leaves gaps in the middle for me to add new transitions if I need to without going and reorganizing all these ops bar numbers, because it's a real pain. And then if I have any separate global transitions that are like cancel or something, I kick those all the way out to 1,000. So they always appear all the way at the end of the workflow dropdown within your issue types. That's just something that helps my life go a little bit easier. Maybe it'll help yours too. Epic status. Don't forget to set epic status if you have an epic workflow. That's a fun surprise where people close an epic and it looks closed in the backlog panel, but surprise, surprise, it's still sitting in to-do in the workflow. So mapping epic status and status changes within a workflow are very important. If you need more help on that, give us a call. We can explain that to you. Paring down resolution options. I find this to be really helpful. So you can use Jira resolution include or Jira resolution exclude properties on your closing transitions. I usually start workflows by giving people just two options, done or canceled, when they resolve an issue, because in most instances, we don't let people delete issues for data retention reasons, except for admins. So always giving somebody a canceled option is very important. And
paring down resolution options just to those two just helps them work a little bit faster. If you want to be really kind, if you have a small custom team that needs a small custom workflow, you could even do different transitions for those so they don't have to select it. But that's a lot of work. Clearing resolutions on workflows that have all global transitions. That's a kind of a rookie mistake, but one that we see all the time. People forget that if you have many global transitions out of closed, every single one of those has to clear the resolution. Otherwise, you're going to have statistics problems later on. Issues are going to look closed that are actually open. Using a version system and describing the changes. So workflow, instructor onboarding 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and maybe keeping those old workflows for a while. It is useful to see the history and the evolution of those workflows as an administrator to see why you maybe don't want to go back to another workflow in the past. Something to note, at least on server, this is a problem. I don't know if they fixed this on cloud, but if you have, you know how when you have multiple statuses in one column in a Kanban board or in a Scrum board, the order of the transitions that appears has nothing to do with the order that they appear in the Kanban configuration in the column. It has to do with the order they were created when you made the workflow. And this is a bug that might be fixed later on in Jira, but this is a fun one when you have, let's say, a canceled global transition and a complete global transition. To get the complete one to appear on top, you may have to go rebuild the workflow from scratch. This is one that I've experienced a few times now already. You can stack global transitions one on top of another. If you go to text in the workflow editor, you can create a new transition, and you can actually have multiple global transitions go to the same status with different labels if you need, setting different resolutions. You might want to give project administrators simplified workflows when possible, because then you can send them out on their way to make their own workflows, and they will never bother you again until they need custom transitions. So that one's quite helpful. Whenever I can take administrative overhead and push it out, much like I don't control my own capillaries, I let my body figure that out for me. If I can send out work out to project administrators, that's a whole lot easier for everybody because they're closer to the work, they know what's going on. And also using back to transition labels. So a lot of people, I think in the interest of brevity, they make somewhat cryptic transition labels. And saying back to indicate that you're taking a step back in the workflow is quite helpful for helping people understand where they actually are in a workflow and that transition is not going the right way. Questions so far? All right. Notifications. Here's a fun one. If you leave Jira notifications on as they're out of the box, people will pretty quickly start making filters and ignore all Jira notifications, especially because of the Notify Reporter one. That's really great for a product owner and sometimes for a project manager, but in general, having Reporter on the default notification scheme seems to create a lot of unnecessary email for a lot of people, especially when somebody creates a bunch of issues. They don't care about it, but they're now the reporter, and now every single change gets kicked back to their inbox. So I tend to start by changing the default to watchers and assignee only. That seems like the most logical set of users that want to know if changes are made to an issue. And then if teams need custom notifications after that, then I go build Reporter. Or I notify on the product owner role, because maybe they want to see all the changes within their project. So yeah, start small. And this is true for everything: workflows, notification schemes, permission schemes. Start with what you need, and then go out and customize as the need grows. You'll probably save yourself a lot of wasted time trying to guess what your users need instead of just waiting for them to tell you. Now, of course, you don't want to go too far down that road and not make any useful changes in the beginning, but usually people will let you know pretty quickly what they need, and they'll let you know when they need it too, which is important. They might not know that they need an in-review status until they actually need it, and when the need arises and you make it for them, it becomes much more useful for them. All right, naming configuration elements. This is just kind of administrator standard activities, but purposefully and consistently label things and have policies for this. So, for example, I always label things with WFS workflow scheme, WF workflow, like just on the end of the name, ITSS issue type screen scheme. This helps administrators, particularly slightly newer ones, remember where they are in the configuration. If they're staring at it and, I'm making changes, why isn't this working? Oh, it's the workflow, not the workflow scheme. I need to go change that too. So it's just a nice little naming tag that helps people remember where they are in the setup. When I do labels on elements, though, I do things that are, if it's project specific and project specific only, I'll start with the project key and then a colon. So for example, on a screen, INQ : create/edit/view. This is very clear. This is the one screen that's used for everything within this project. Or if I have multiple projects that cover a similar business purpose, I do the business purpose : create/edit/view. So inquiries, create, edit, view. And maybe I have multiple inquiries projects. And this just helps people find the stuff later on in the database. It's just much, much clearer. I also make reusable screens right off the bat: transition : comment only, transition : resolve, transition : assign, transition : link. That's quite helpful. Trying to make sure that there's anything else that might actually be useful. Because I got a whole bunch of these and I don't want to waste everybody's time this afternoon. Well, no, to be honest, we could probably skip the rest of these if there's more important things for people to get to. This is kind of down in the weeds, to be honest. I don't want to waste everybody's time when we have a really good panel to talk to later on as well, because I know we're all going to be in this. Well, if you want to know more about all this fun, great stuff, engage us. We're a nice company. We'll talk to you anytime.